today, I cannot help but feel the weight.
5 minutes ago, a letter never meant to be seen slipped into the light. What it reveals about Camilla is not scandal, it is something far more dangerous. Because this time, the truth didn't come from rumor, it came from Charles himself. The leak that should never have happened. It began, as these things often do, in silence. Not the quiet of peace, but the kind that settles just before something breaks. In the early hours of a grey London morning, when the corridors of Buckingham Palace were still wrapped in that familiar, almost sacred stillness, a single document moved quietly, almost invisibly. Beyond the boundaries it was never meant to cross. No announcement, no warning, just a letter, private, handwritten, marked for no eyes but one, and within minutes, everything changed. It did not appear on the front pages first. That would have been too obvious, too controlled. Instead, it surfaced where modern crises are born, not in print but in fragments. A blurred image, a partial paragraph, a line of unmistakable handwriting that those within royal circles would recognize instantly. The signature alone was enough to stop breath. Charles. Not a statement, not dictated, not filtered through advisors or softened by press secretaries. This was something else entirely. Something unguarded. And that is what made it dangerous. Because within the monarchy, it is not what is said publicly that carries the greatest weight. It is what is written in private, when the performance ends and the truth begins to surface, quietly, without permission. At first, there was hesitation. Senior aides did not rush. They paused. They verified. They cross-checked handwriting, ink patterns, paper stock, details so precise they bordered on forensic obsession. Because if this letter was authentic, then it was not just a breach of privacy. It was a fracture. And fractures in institutions like this do not stay contained. By mid-morning, the atmosphere inside the palace had shifted. Phones began to ring, not loudly, but persistently. Conversations were no longer casual, but coded. Doors that were usually left slightly open were now firmly closed. Staff who had worked together for years avoided eye contact, as though acknowledging the situation too directly might somehow make it worse. Because everyone understood what was at stake. This was not a rumor constructed from speculation, not a distorted headline built on second-hand whispers. This was a direct line, ink to paper, from the king himself, and it had slipped. No one, at least not officially, could yet explain how. There were theories, of course. A misfiled archive, a copied document left unsecured, a trusted hand that had, for reasons unknown, chosen the wrong moment to be careless, or perhaps not careless at all. Because within systems built on loyalty, the most destabilizing possibility is not error, it is intention. And so the question began to circulate, quietly, carefully, in the spaces between conversations. Was this an accident or a message? By late morning, the letter had already begun to travel beyond its point of origin. What started as a fragment was becoming something more complete. Sentences aligned, context formed, and with each passing minute, the tone of what Charles had written, his unfiltered tone, became harder to ignore. There was something in it that did not belong to the official language, not the measured cadence of monarchy, not the carefully balanced neutrality expected of a sovereign. This was personal, unmistakably so, and that is what sent the first real wave of concern through the palace. Because personal, in this context, does not simply mean emotional, it means uncontrolled. By early afternoon, the first emergency consultation was already underway. Not in a grand chamber, but in a smaller, more discreet room, one used precisely for moments like this, when visibility must be minimized and decisions must be made quickly, without spectacle. Senior advisors gathered, communications strategists were called in, legal considerations were raised, then quietly set aside in favor of something more immediate, containment. But containment requires clarity, and clarity, at that moment, was still just out of reach. Because while the letter was real, of that there was now little doubt, the intent behind it remained uncertain. Was it reflective? Was it confessional? Was it written in a moment of vulnerability that was never meant to be preserved, let alone exposed? Or was it something else entirely? Something deliberate. That uncertainty created a tension that could not be easily resolved. Because if the letter revealed too much, it risked destabilizing more than just perception. It risked exposing something deeper, something long managed, carefully structured, and rarely acknowledged beyond the inner circle. And at the center of it all, quietly but unmistakably, was one name: Camilla. Not as a public figure, not as a consort framed by ceremony and duty, but as something more complicated, more human, more contested. And as that realization began to take hold, the tone inside the palace shifted once again. This was no longer about a document, it was about what the document revealed. Because in institutions built on control, the most dangerous thing is not opposition. It is a truth that was never meant to be seen, and now, that truth, whatever it fully contained, was no longer hidden. It was moving, expanding, and with every passing moment, it becomes harder to contain. A letter written in silence. The letter had not been written in haste. That much became clear almost immediately to those who understood the rhythm of Charles's private world. This was not the work of a distracted moment or a passing frustration captured on paper. It carried the weight of stillness. The kind of stillness that only arrives when a man has been thinking for far too long and finally decides, quietly, to put those thoughts somewhere they cannot argue back. It had been written days earlier, not in the presence of advisors, not dictated through layers of protocol, but alone, in a room where the noise of duty could no longer reach him. A private study, familiar and controlled, yet increasingly distant from the version of himself the world believed it knew. There is a particular kind of isolation that comes with the crown. It is not the absence of people. Charles has never lacked for company. Staff move around him constantly. Voices surround him. Decisions are discussed, debated, documented. Yet, none of that touches the space where private truth resides. That space remains untouched, even protected, because once it is exposed, it cannot be reclaimed. And on that evening, it seems, something within him crossed that boundary. The timing itself is telling. This was not written during the ceremony or public strain. It did not follow a visible crisis. There had been no obvious rupture in the carefully maintained image of stability. Appearances had held, engagements had continued, smiles had been exchanged in the quiet choreography expected of royal life. But that is often when the deeper tensions surface, not in chaos, but in calm, because calm creates space, and space allows thought to expand beyond its usual limits. It is within that expansion that the letter was born. Those who later examined its tone noticed something unusual. The language was not polished. It lacked the careful structure that typically defines royal communication. Sentences moved with a kind of hesitation, as though the writer was not entirely certain where each thought would land once it reached the page. And yet, there was clarity within that hesitation. Not the clarity of strategy, but the clarity of honesty. Charles was not writing to persuade. He was not writing to instruct. He was writing to release something that had remained unspoken for far too long. That is what gives the letter its emotional gravity, because it was not meant to perform. It was meant to exist. The paper itself offered further insight. It was not the standard stationery used for official correspondence. There were no crests, no formal markings, no indication that this was part of any institutional record. This was personal material, chosen deliberately. Almost as though he understood, even then, that what he was about to write could not belong to the machinery of the monarchy. It had to remain separate, private, contained. And yet, paradoxically, it is that very separation that made its eventual exposure so significant. Because when something is written outside the system, it reveals what the system cannot safely hold. There were moments within the letter where the handwriting itself shifted. Slight inconsistencies, pressure changes, lines that began firmly and ended with a subtle tremor, not dramatic enough to suggest distress, but enough to indicate something more internal. A hesitation not of the hand, but of the heart attempting to decide how much truth it was willing to allow forward. This was not the writing of a man in control of his narrative. This was the writing of a man confronting it, and that distinction matters. Because for decades, Charles has existed within a structure that required careful calibration of every word. Every expression has been weighed against consequence. Every statement is shaped to preserve balance. That discipline does not disappear easily, which is why its absence in this letter is so striking. It suggests not carelessness, but release. A moment where the burden of maintaining that balance became too heavy to carry in silence. The question, then, is not simply what he wrote, it is why he chose to write it at all. There are indications that the letter was never intended to travel far. It was addressed not to an institution, but to an individual, someone within his inner orbit, someone who would understand context without explanation, someone trusted enough to receive thoughts that could not be spoken aloud. That trust now sits at the center of the unfolding situation. Because trust, once broken, does not leave clean edges. It fractures in ways that are difficult to trace. Was the letter shared unintentionally? Was it preserved in a place where too many eyes could eventually find it? Or was it passed forward with purpose, its contents deemed too significant to remain hidden? Inside the palace, no one has offered a definitive answer, and perhaps that is because the truth itself is uncomfortable. Not just in its content, but in what it suggests about the boundaries that no longer hold as firmly as they once did. What is clear, however, is this. The letter was not an accident of emotion. It was the result of accumulation. Years of observation, compromise, and internal negotiation brought to a single, quiet moment where silence was no longer sufficient. And in choosing to break that silence, even privately, Charles altered something fundamental. Because once a truth is written, it exists in a form that can be seen. And once it can be seen, it carries the possibility of being discovered, which is exactly what has now happened. A moment intended for privacy has become something else entirely. Something public, something irreversible, and at the center of it all remains the same quiet reality. This was never meant to be read beyond one pair of eyes, yet now it is being read by many. And with every new reader, the meaning of that letter continues to expand, carrying with it implications that reach far beyond the page on which it was written. What Charles really said about Camilla? By the time the full contents of the letter began to take shape, the atmosphere surrounding it had already changed. What had first appeared as a curiosity, a fragment of private expression, was now something far more defined. The scattered lines that had circulated in isolation were no longer drifting without context. They had aligned. They had formed a narrative. And within that narrative, one presence stood at the center with undeniable weight. Camilla. Not referenced in passing, not framed through duty or ceremony, but written about with a depth that felt unusually unguarded. Those who read the letter closely noticed this immediately. The tone was not hostile. It was not openly critical. In fact, that is what made it more unsettling, because what Charles expressed was something far more complex than simple disagreement or dissatisfaction. It was a conflict, quiet, layered, and deeply personal. He did not speak of Camilla as the world sees her. There were no references to titles, no mention of public roles, no attempt to anchor her identity within the structure of the monarchy. Instead, he wrote about her as a presence in his life, a constant, a force that had shaped his private world in ways that could not easily be explained in public language. And within that reflection, there was a tension that could not be ignored. At moments, his words carried warmth, a recognition of shared history, of loyalty that had endured through years that would have broken lesser bonds. He acknowledged what they had survived together, the scrutiny, the judgment, the long and often painful road toward acceptance. But that acknowledgement did not settle into comfort. It shifted, gradually, almost imperceptibly, into something else. There were phrases that suggested distance. Not physical distance, but emotional separation that had grown quietly over time. He described moments where understanding no longer came as easily as it once had, where conversations, once effortless, had become measured, where silence had begun to occupy spaces that were once filled with certainty. This was not presented as blame. It was presented as an observation, and that is what made it so revealing. Because observation, in its purest form, carries a kind of honesty that accusation often avoids. It does not exaggerate. It does not perform. It simply records what is felt, even when that feeling is difficult to name. There were also indications of something deeper beneath that observation. A question, unspoken, but present throughout the letter. Had the nature of their relationship changed in ways that neither of them had fully acknowledged? Charles did not answer this directly. He did not draw conclusions or attempt to define what he was experiencing. Instead, he circled it, returning to the same emotional ground from different angles, as though trying to understand something that refused to remain still long enough to be clearly seen. He wrote of expectations, not imposed by others, but created between them over time. Expectations of understanding, of support, of shared perspective. And within those expectations, there was a quiet recognition that something had shifted, not dramatically, but enough to be felt. There was one passage, in particular, that drew the most attention from those who reviewed the letter in full, a line that, while not overtly dramatic, carried a weight that lingered long after it was read. He wrote that there are moments when proximity does not guarantee connection. It was a simple sentence, but within the context of everything else, it became something more. It suggested a kind of solitude that exists even within closeness, a realization that being beside someone does not always mean being fully understood by them. And, for a man who has spent much of his life navigating relationships under the pressure of public expectation, that realization carries significant meaning. There were also references to time, not in a nostalgic sense, but in a reflective one. He considered how the passage of years had altered not just circumstances, but perception itself. How the same relationship, viewed through different stages of life, can feel fundamentally different without ever fully breaking. That continuity, paired with change, created a tension that he seemed unable to fully resolve. He did not speak of separation, he did not suggest rupture. But he acknowledged, in a way that felt both restrained and unmistakable, that what exists now is not identical to what once was. And perhaps more importantly, he did not attempt to disguise that recognition. There was no effort to soften it into something more acceptable. No attempt to align it with the expectations of how such a relationship should be presented. He allowed it to remain as it was, uncertain, evolving, and quietly complicated. What makes this particularly significant is not simply the content of what he wrote, but the fact that he allowed himself to write it at all. Because within the structure of royal life, such reflections are rarely committed to paper. They remain internal, managed, and carefully separated from anything that could one day be seen. Yet here, in this letter, those boundaries were crossed, not recklessly, but deliberately. And in doing so, Charles revealed something that cannot easily be undone. Not a scandal, not a dramatic confession, but something far more enduring, a glimpse into the reality that exists behind the image. A reality where even the most established relationships are subject to change, to distance, to quiet moments of uncertainty that do not announce themselves, but slowly reshape everything around them. And now, that reality is no longer private. It has been seen, it has been read, and once something like that is exposed, it does not return to silence unchanged. The fractures behind closed doors. Long before the letter was written, the fractures had already begun to form, not loudly, not in ways that could be easily observed from the outside. There were no public disagreements, no visible breaks in composure, no moments that would have signaled to the world that something within the relationship was shifting. On the surface, everything remained intact. Appearances were maintained with precision, engagements were carried out as expected. The quiet choreography of royal life continued without interruption. They stood together when required, spoke when necessary, and moved through their roles with the familiarity of two people who understood exactly what was expected of them. But beneath that surface, something more subtle had taken root. It is often in long-standing relationships that the most significant changes occur without announcement, not through conflict, but through accumulation. Small moments left unaddressed, thoughts unspoken, adjustments made quietly until those adjustments become the new normal. And over time, that new normal begins to feel different, not broken, but altered. Those within the inner circle had, on occasion, sensed it. Not in anything that could be documented, but in atmosphere. A slight shift in tone during private discussions, a pause where there once would have been immediate agreement, a carefulness that had replaced a kind of natural ease, nothing that could be named directly, but enough to be felt. The nature of their relationship had always been shaped by complexity. It had not followed a conventional path. It had endured scrutiny that few relationships could survive, let alone recover from. That shared history created a bond that was both resilient and, at times, difficult to navigate. Because survival does not erase what came before, it carries it forward. And in carrying it forward, it changes the way each new moment is experienced. There were expectations that came with that history, not imposed from the outside, but developed internally over years of navigating challenge together, and understanding that they would move in alignment, that decisions, perspectives, and responses would reflect a shared view. For a long time, that alignment held, but alignment, like anything else, is not fixed. It requires continual adjustment. And when those adjustments begin to fall out of sync, the change is rarely immediate. It does not arrive as conflict, it arrives as distance. A quiet separation in perspective that grows slowly, almost invisibly, until it becomes difficult to ignore. There were moments, it is said, when discussions that once flowed easily began to take on a different tone, not confrontational, but measured, words chosen more carefully. Responses delivered with a slight delay, as though each was considering not just what to say, but how it would be received. This is not the language of disagreement, it is the language of caution. And caution, in a relationship built on long familiarity, often signals something deeper. It suggests that certainty has shifted, that what was once assumed no longer feels entirely secure. There were also indications of differing approaches to the pressures that surrounded them. The demands of public life, the expectations placed upon their roles, the constant presence of scrutiny. These are forces that do not remain static. They evolve, intensify, recede, and return in different forms. How one responds to those pressures can change over time, and when two people begin to respond differently, even subtly, it can create a space between them that was not there before. Not a divide, but a distance. One that does not announce itself, but gradually becomes part of the landscape of the relationship. It is within that landscape that the letter begins to make sense. Because what Charles expressed did not emerge in isolation. It was the reflection of something that had been forming over time. A recognition, perhaps, that the connection they had relied upon had begun to shift in ways that neither had fully articulated. There is also the matter of role. Within the monarchy, personal relationships do not exist entirely on their own terms. They are shaped, influenced, and at times constrained by the responsibilities that surround them. The line between private and public is never entirely clear. Each affects the other in ways that are difficult to separate. And over time, that can create tension, not because of any single event, but because of the constant negotiation required to maintain both. There are moments when the demands of duty align with personal understanding, and there are moments when they do not. It is in those moments that fractures can begin to form, quietly, without announcement, without visible disruption, but with a persistence that is difficult to reverse once it has taken hold. What makes these fractures particularly significant is that they do not always seek resolution. They do not necessarily lead to confrontation or collapse. Instead, they settle into the structure of the relationship itself, becoming part of how it functions moving forward. A new equilibrium, different from what existed before, but stable enough to continue, at least for a time. And perhaps that is the most important distinction, because stability does not always mean harmony. It can also mean adaptation, an adjustment to circumstances that have changed, even if those changes are not fully acknowledged. The letter, then, is not the beginning of this story. It is a moment within it. A moment where something that had remained internal was given form, where the quiet reality of those fractures was, for the first time, expressed in a way that could be seen. And now that it has been seen, it becomes part of the narrative in a way that cannot be undone. Because what exists behind closed doors does not remain there forever, not when it has already found its way onto the page. Palace panic and strategic containment. The response began before the full scale of the situation had even settled. Inside Buckingham Palace, movement replaced stillness with quiet urgency. Not chaos, never chaos, but a controlled acceleration that only occurs when something serious has breached the surface. Doors closed, conversations lowered, priorities shifted instantly. This was no longer about understanding the letter. It was about controlling what came next. An emergency meeting was convened within hours. Senior advisors, communications officials, and legal representatives gathered in a room that had hosted similar moments before, though rarely with stakes this personal. The tone was measured, but beneath that restraint was a clear recognition of risk, because this was not a narrative that had been prepared. It had not been shaped, reviewed, or timed for release. It existed outside the system, and that made it unpredictable. The first objective was simple: contain the spread. Efforts were made to limit circulation of the letter in its complete form. Partial fragments had already moved beyond reach, but there was still a window, however narrow, to prevent further expansion. Quiet requests were issued, certain channels were contacted. Language was carefully chosen to discourage amplification without drawing attention to what was being suppressed. It was a delicate balance. Too much resistance would signal significance. Too little would allow the story to grow unchecked. At the same time, a second strategy began to take shape. Reframe the narrative. If the contents could not be entirely contained, then they would need to be contextualized, interpreted in a way that reduced their impact. Positioned as reflective, perhaps even routine, a private expression not indicative of any broader reality. But this approach carried its own risk, because the tone of the letter did not easily align with routine explanation. Those who had read it understood that, and so the discussions became more precise. What could be acknowledged? What must be avoided? How to respond without confirming too much, yet without appearing dismissive. There were also internal considerations. Trust. How the letter had left its intended space. Who had access? Whether this was a lapse or something more deliberate. These questions were not addressed openly, but they were present in every conversation, shaping decisions in ways that were not immediately visible. By the end of the day, a strategy had been outlined. Careful, controlled, incomplete. Because full control was no longer possible. The letter existed beyond the palace now, and containment, no matter how precise, could only go so far. What remained was management. And the understanding that this was no longer a private matter trying to stay hidden. It was a public reality being carefully guided, one response at a time. The truth that cannot be taken back. By the time the palace had settled into its strategy, one reality had already become impossible to ignore. The truth, once written and revealed, does not return to where it came from. It lingers, not loudly, not always visibly, but with a quiet persistence that reshapes everything around it. What Charles expressed in that letter was never designed for public interpretation. It was not crafted to withstand scrutiny or to exist within the structured language of monarchy. It was personal, reflective, and above all, honest in a way that official statements rarely are. And that honesty now exists beyond his control. Inside Buckingham Palace, there is an understanding that no response, no matter how measured, can fully reverse what has already been set in motion. Narratives can be guided, attention can be redirected, but the core of what has been revealed cannot be undone, because it has already been seen. The implications of that are not immediate. They unfold slowly, in perception, in interpretation. In the quiet way, people begin to reconsider what they thought they understood. The image remains intact on the surface, but beneath it, something has shifted, not dramatically, but permanently. For Charles, the consequence is not scandal in the traditional sense. There is no clear accusation, no definitive statement that can be denied or corrected. Instead, there is ambiguity. A space between what was written and what it means, where interpretation begins to take hold. And interpretation, once it spreads, is difficult to contain. For Camilla, the impact is even more delicate, because what was revealed does not attack her directly, yet it places her within a narrative she did not choose to enter. A narrative shaped not by public role, but by private reflection. And in that space, the usual protections of position offer little defense. The monarchy itself absorbs this in a different way. It does not fracture outwardly. It adjusts. It continues. That is what it has always done. But each moment like this leaves an imprint. A subtle alteration in how the institution is perceived, and perhaps more importantly, how it understands itself. This is not a collapse. It is a shift. One that cannot be formally acknowledged, yet cannot be ignored, because the letter, in its quiet way, has done something rare. It has revealed not a crisis, but a truth. And truths, once exposed, do not disappear. They settle into memory, they become part of the story. And no matter how carefully the next chapter is written, this one will remain unchanged, impossible to take back, and impossible to forget.